Welcome to False Market Value, a podcast featuring real-world analysis of fictional sponsorship from movies, TV, books, music, and other pop culture. This episode is produced by DJ Cruiser from KSD Studios out of Fort Mill, South Carolina. I'm your host, Ross Kennerly, founder of Quant Sponsorship Consulting in Las Vegas. My guest this week is Joe Canfield, founder and CEO of Fairways Relationship Management and Director of Affinity Partnerships for the University of Utah. How you doing, Joe? Thanks for joining us.
I'm good, Ross. Thanks for having me here. This is going to be fun.
I'm excited for this one. So tell us a little bit about Fairways Relationship Management. What does your company do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I coach golf, and this is the short version of it, but we take a little spin on it where we help people build relationships to the game of golf. So I've played golf my entire life, and when I was going through business school, I was like, you know what? We need a class that does 1 credit hour of teaching people how to do business through golf. And when I started working in sponsorships, I played a lot of golf with people. And the first round I went out and played, I made a fool of myself, right? I didn't know what I was doing. So I tried to go find a course that taught how to do it. I couldn't find it. So I said, okay, fine. I'm the guy to do it. So 7 years later, with lots of notes and things like that, I'm here teaching people how to play golf and how to strike deals on the golf course. It's a lot of fun.
Well, you and I have known each other for a while, but what gave me the idea for this episode of this podcast that we could do together was something you posted on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago about only getting 4 hours a week to spend with your wife, and that's on the golf course. And she had never played before, and that your family has a longstanding history playing golf. So do you want to summarize that article? Because I love that. I mean, talk about the perfect way to, tug at the heartstrings around your brand and why you decided to pursue what you did. I love that piece.
Yeah. So my dad bought my wife a set of golf clubs when we got engaged and said, welcome to the family. You play golf now. And she played soccer in college. I know she thought it was kind of funny too, but she played soccer in college, and so she's an athlete. And we went out and played golf, and it like really bugged her about how bad she was at it. And she told me this. I didn't know this till later, but she told me, she's like, I was super anxious to go play golf with you and your dad because I knew that there were all these rules. I didn't know any of them, and I've had that conversation with other people as well, business professionals, people who have played for a while. They're always like, you know what, I'm scared to make a fool of myself and embarrass myself. And, when she shared that with me, I was like, okay. And that was a few years after I'd had this idea to start this thing. And I was like, okay, I'm onto something here. We're going to go for it. If you feel like this, clearly there's plenty of other people out there that feel the same way. So anyway, she's a good sport about it. And she's actually gotten really good in a short amount of time, it's a lot of fun to be able to spend time doing that.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, I can't think of another company of its like that does exactly what you do. And what you were just saying made me think of the scene from I Love You, Man, where they go on the golf course and there's the guy that's behind Siegel and Rudd, and he's like, ready to play, ready to play, ready to play, ready to play, like yelling at them. And yeah, that would be like my worst nightmare if I had never played before.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Oh man. But, well, it's interesting because I had the idea of, we should do something about golf. And the first thing that popped into my head was Tin Cup, just because one, it's a famous golf film, legendary cult classic directed by Ron Shelton. But I was thinking that I would have to find a sponsorship from the film that we could do as part of the podcast, because as I've mentioned on previous podcasts, I don't want to just do a film podcast. It has to be sponsorship being the key to talking about a movie that we both enjoy. And then rewatching it last night, and really paying attention to the sponsorship elements, there is a lot here that I think that we can go through and talk about a film coming out at the epicenter of when golf shifted gears, or to use probably a poor metaphor, when Iron Man's suit gets supercharged and all of a sudden everything goes from 0 to 1,000%. That's basically what happened with golf right around the time that this film came out. I mean, literally within 6 months, I think, of this film being released. So could not have picked a better film to do this. I'm really excited to do this with you, Joe. The year is 1996. The movie is Tin Cup. The sponsorship is the Golden Tassel sponsorship of Roy McAvoy's golf bag during the fictional 1995 U.S. Open. And this is False Market Value. I'm playing for Rio Grande Short Haul Trucking, Brinkston Brown Sanitation. You think a guy like me worries about percentages? Well, it's interesting. And Joe, I know we want to start sort of, as I was alluding to in the intro there, what was going on in golf at the time and what was about to happen in the history of golf. And you are obviously, you and your family are way more not only skilled in the game of golf, but you have more expertise in the game of golf than I do. I will say, and I think I shared this before, the last time we played around and we were playing out at Angel Park here in Las Vegas. My first job, official job that wasn't working on a farm in northern Michigan, was working on a golf course. And so the gig was, I would show up at the Muskong golf course at 6 a.m. and I would wash golf carts until noon. So I'd wash for about 6 hours and then I would get free golf lessons from the local golf pro. And that was the first official job I ever had. I never kept up with golf after high school simply because I felt like I didn't have the temperament for it. A lot of the things that you train in terms of etiquette, I kind of picked up on the fly from people that played, but I didn't really find enjoyment in the game. And it's an expensive game to play if you don't feel like you know what you're doing when you get out there, not only in terms of skills, but in terms of the etiquette portion of that. So I find what you do and what your company does fascinating. But with that said, there's a lot going on in golf in 1996 and previously in 1995 when this was filmed. Obviously, the sponsorship we're talking about is at a fictional U.S. Open on a different network. So it's broadcast on CBS, which I believe in the real world it was on NBC that year, and held in Detroit. This one's held in North Carolina. So there's a lot of fictional elements with it. But a lot of what was happening in sponsorship and in golf is depicted on screen, but it's very subtle, but very obvious to me now, including the way that Roy McAvoy recognizes his sponsors. I would consider him maybe almost a sponsor visionary and a great representation or precursor of what is going to happen 25, 30 years later. But can you sort of give us some background on professional golf, where it was at the time, how it got there, and where it was going to go, and how that relates to where we are now? And then I think we can really drill into the sponsorship elements. And obviously the point of this podcast is to show, how does sponsorship change over time? This is a great example because how this was done in 95 compared to how this is done now, it's almost like worlds apart, maybe more so than any other sector. So with that, Joe, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, golf was experiencing kind of its second renaissance, if you will, in 96. The first coming, greatest game ever played, another movie that kind of depicts that moment in time when golf kind of became popular in the U.S. back in the 1920s, right? With Francis W. May.
I love that movie.
That's a great one. If you haven't seen it, it's very Disneyed, but it's a good way to pick up on the story of what was happening with golf in the U.S. back in the 1920s. Golf's always been a staple in Britain, and it's been around there forever. The Open used to be called the British Open, and now they're like, wait a minute, we're going to it is the Open, right? But 96, you had a guy named Tiger come along, right? First professional event was that year. And, if we're speaking about brands and sponsorship, Nike is getting huge into the sponsorship game at the time, right? They're pushing boundaries in tennis. They're pushing boundaries, and tennis is really where they got their start, right? And I can't remember the ad campaign, but it was break things, right? Tennis was this country club sport. Golf was this country club sport, this posh thing that only rich white guys could play, right? Tiger comes along. It was I can't remember who it was on the tennis side. They was pushing the boundaries, right? They were trying to break stuff. That was Nike's whole thing, break stuff, right? And they did. And they opened up golf to a whole new demographic. And it's actually cool being in Utah right now because we're seeing the same thing with Tony Finau, how he's a minority. He grew up in a very poor area of Salt Lake City, hitting balls into a mattress. If you don't know his story, look it up. It's awesome. But you're seeing the same thing happen in Salt Lake, where you're getting so many youth into the game. and
Yep.
youth of different backgrounds, because they see somebody like them playing on the PGA Tour. They all of a sudden think it's possible. And so that was what was happening in 96, is this rich
Yep.
white man's game is now accessible to the normal person, right? And so that's kind of the background with 96 and what was happening. And then now,
And some of the research I'd shared with you was pre-Tiger. Nike's golf portfolio was non-existent.
Right.
In fact, I think one of the articles that I saw said it isn't even worth discussing until they invested a boatload of money in Tiger Woods in 1996. And this I didn't know until I was researching. Tiger's first professional outing was actually an exemption paid for by a sponsor to get him on the course. That is incredible. Talk about breaking stuff.
Yeah, there's an interview from that after. I can't remember the interviewer he's talking with, but Tiger sits down and says, "I'm going to come out here and win." And he's like, "Well, that's kind of a posh attitude to have." And I think the line the guy uses is, "You'll learn." And Tiger just kind of sit there like, "Why would I come out and play a tournament if I wasn't going to try to win?"
Right.
That was a cool line. And if we're jumping into Roy McAvoy,
the poise at, how old was he then? 20?
he was 16 when he played in his first professional event. I mean, obviously he didn't catch on for a few years, but nowadays you go back and you're like, yeah, it was 1996 Tiger Woods. But you get into the Tin Cup and you kind of feel the same thing, right? It's this guy who doesn't really belong. The whole golf world's looking at him like, you're a joke. What are you doing here? You're only here because the sponsor's paying for you to be here. And it really kind of, that parallel is kind of, it's funny that it was all happening at the same time.
Yeah, it's a different type of disruption in Tin Cup. His entrance into the U.S. Open and the impact that he has there, replicating apparently his golf coaches for the film's real life anecdotes where he shot a 12 on the 18th hole simply to prove that he could hit a shot. And then they bring that in as the dramatic thematic element at the end of the film. But there are some parallels between Tiger's rise in pro golf and what would have been, call it Roy McAvoy's ascension in the sport around the same time, which seems to me to indicate so when this film came out, I was 17, and I don't think I was aware at the time, and I don't think a lot of people are aware of, whether it's in sports or in culture or what the case is. I think there's a few instances where someone is living through an epic where they say, I'm aware that what I'm doing right now is going to be important someday. I was not aware of, being a rather active amateur high school golfer at the time, with friends and such during the summer, was not aware of how primed that sport was for, as you call it, a renaissance, where it needed a refresh. And whether it was, fictionally represented someone scripting something like Tin Cup and saying this would be fun to show on screen because golf needs a disruption, and then in real life having someone like Tiger enter the game and completely change everything, seems like that was just a formative time in golf, as you said, where now the way that purses are paid for, the way that professional golfers on any of the circuits or in any of the leagues represent and activate their sponsorships, how tournaments service sponsors and what type of recognition they provide, what the fees are paid for those compared to what they were before. Somewhere it said pre-Tiger in 1996, the total purses across everything in professional golf was in the neighborhood a little bit less than $80 million. And then post-Tiger, 25 years later, 30 years later, we're looking at upwards of $300 million that are the purses that are paid out to the winners every single year. And that happened with sponsorship too, and visibility. It just skyrocketed.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. U.S. Open 1996 winner won $425,000. Last year it was $2.2 million. So, I mean, you do some math there with inflation and it's still, quadruple the amount of money that they're making. And a lot of that is due because of how much more sponsors are paying to be a part of this. And a lot of it, I think, is because of how, I don't know if innovative is the right word, but the way that the PGA Tour and professional golf has changed the way they activate on sponsorships and the value that they're able to drive back to brands it's huge. And it's also the TV numbers. It's the how many more people are watching now than there were in '96, and accessibility and streaming and everything else. There's so many more eyeballs on any event happening these days, but that sponsor dollar amount is what's driving purses to go up, along with other goofy things that are going on right now, like Live and, the TGL and all that fun stuff that's forcing the hand of some of these tours. But it's crazy to me, sitting in a university setting doing sponsorships, what the spend is in professional sports. It's insane to me.
So you manage affinity partnerships for the University of Utah. Can you talk about what affinity means in a university context for listeners that might not know what that means?
Yeah, so universities are extremely hard places to navigate. We're very siloed. There's hundreds of departments across the university. And so my role is to help the sponsors navigate that and be a single point of contact for the whole university. So I manage things like our pouring rights deals. We have a credit union and things like that that I manage for the entire campus and make sure that things behind the scenes are happening right. So, yeah.
And we had talked a little bit about this before we started recording when we were preparing for this, but how important, both in the company that you run, in your role at Utah, and as it relates to Tin Cup, is, as we've called it, congruence or congruity between the brands that you work with or represent and you service and the property that they're sponsoring. Because there's a lot of research when you said the type of value that sponsors are able to deliver for players and vice versa, how important that is to the success of what these relationships look like. And that might not have been the case in the mid-90s when this type of film came out. How important is that element of sponsorship to what you do in all capacities?
Yeah. I think that the thing that is so important about relationships and what's happening in sponsorship now compared to 96 is 96. Like I'm watching Tin Cup and I'm looking at all the other sponsors that are in that movie.
Yeah, me too.
And it's like, it's
Toyota. So David Sims, visor.
David Sims is Infinity, right?
It's Infinity during the USGA, but during his charity golf tournament, it's Toyota.
Okay. Which is the same company. Yeah. That's funny that it changes. I also noticed a couple of other changes that we can get into that was kind of funny, but I'm looking at the sponsorships in Tin Cup and a lot of them are national, worldwide brands, right? Whereas today you look at PGA Tour and a lot of guys have local companies on it. I mentioned Tony Finau earlier. He's got Qualtrics on his bag, which is a Utah company. He's got a few other local kind of Silicon Slope type companies that are on there because they know that he has this huge impact locally, right? And they're able to play on that have that local play as well as the national play when he's winning tournaments in the FedEx Cup, right, on a huge national stage. And so I think that kind of hyper localization aspect is what is really different about today than was what going on in 96, because you're just kind of hoping and praying back then that one of your guys is getting on TV for however long it might be. Whereas now with social media and every other thing that they have to put them on. Tony was just on the Netflix Cup, right? Brand exposure like crazy for some random event going on. None of that was happening in 96.
It's interesting, and this, I guess, expounds on your point a little bit. So Adam Hadwin started his first sponsorship when he started was Belfour Property Restoration, which was a hyper local organization. And he said they gave him $2,000 to be on the bag, similar to the Golden Tassel. Doreen's company that she manages in this film. But it was a hyper logo organization. They paid him $2,000 a week for a logo on his bag and on his shirt. And they are still a sponsor of his. And that scaled up as he became more successful as a professional golfer. And so those relationships can be really meaningful, and that hyper localization is represented by their partners as they become more successful, continue to take along those brands that are part of their roots and where they started on their journey throughout their career as a professional athlete as they become more successful. And I think that's really telling to what makes some of these partnerships successful, or what a model for a successful partnership can look like. Is it's not just, as the article I had shared with you before this podcast dove into, from, I believe it's the Toronto Star. It was talking about how these relationships aren't just about dollars anymore. It's about building long-term relationships, and that even on the agent side, when they're representing these brands, is to look at the big long-term picture for developing relationships with partners. And it seems like, referring back to your comment about hyper-localization, they're local organizations that have a vested interest in the athlete and where they're going to go in their career, and they'll stay with them for 20 years. And that's sort of been, I don't want to call it a hidden trend, but it's been a trend over the years. And when golf really took off post Tiger, it was a lot of the big corporate name brands that you see out at the US Open, in this film. But the Kevin Costner, Roy McAvoy model, representing Salome, Texas, and all those local brands, that's pretty realistic to how that would be done today.
It absolutely is. And the thing that is it's so hard to become a professional golfer. Like the chances of you ending up on tour. I mean, I know a few players that have played in college, and they're unbelievable players. I consider myself to be good, but when I go play with these guys, I look like I haven't swung a golf club before, and they didn't have a chance. I had one friend, he played on the Latin America tour, and best golfer I've ever played with. The dude is unbelievable. I mean, he hits a drive 100 yards past mine, and I'm not a short player.
Oh my God.
I asked him one day, I was like, well, what's the difference between you and a guy who makes it? And he goes, out there on the Latin America tour, every single player, every single guy is just as good as I am. What the difference is luck, and if they can find the right people to back them. And if you have that, because it's expensive too. I mean, to qualify for a U.S. Open, you're out probably between $10,000 and $15,000 just in registration fees alone. Right. And that's before you've even done your travel to actually play in the U.S. Open, any of that. Right.
That was one of my questions for you. We can come back to that when we wrap up on the false market value portion of this.
But what I'm getting at here is these companies, they get these guys when they're young, and we're starting to see this with NIL, and I'm excited to see where it's going to go with guys who are, because we haven't had a lot of players jump to the NFL or other professional leagues yet in the NIL era. So it's going to be interesting to see how those deals will translate into their professional careers. But like the article you sent me had Brooke Henderson in here, and she has like a local golf shop that she still reps on her shirt. And that local golf shop took a chance when she was young, giving her some money to pay some entry fees so she can try to go pro. And the players, and this is the smart play in my opinion, are showing that they're grateful for that money, seed money almost, by continuing to rep those brands. And brands are happy to make take that risk when they know that the people are going to be loyal to the brand, right? Yeah,
and it hews close to, in a good way, when those who are unfamiliar with just the sponsorship industry in general think about the term sponsor or sponsorship. That tends to be what they think of, especially if they're going out to sell it for the first time, which is, I will get some companies that will help me pay for the event I'm putting on. And then when you bring in a consultant, which is a lot of the work that I've done in my career, the conversation is, well, you have to look at what the value or rather where the value is coming from in the relationship. And that can be exposure, which is a lot of what Nike was looking for in paying the amount of money they did for Tiger, because they saw the potential there. And that was one of the notes I had from the research too, is when brands invest in pro athletes, like pro golfers, the way it was phrased was they're looking at it like buying stock. So they look at where the athlete is going to go in their career, the likelihood for television media coverage, the alignment with who they are as a brand, shared values, all that stuff that you look for in a sponsorship, they look for in an endorsement of a pro golfer. But those types of things carry value, and it isn't necessarily we're just going to pay for your registration fees, although certainly when you're just starting out, that's what the money is used for. So those early days in their career, it sounds like those relationships hew closer to what people think of when they say the word sponsor, which is basically paying for them to get off the ground. And that's true for a lot of athletes in the amateur sector. And we've done a couple podcasts here, and one eventually I would like to do about amateur basketball, like junior league basketball in the Washington, D.C. area, which hopefully we can get that together at some point. But all of those things represented fictionally and in real life are brands that are investing early in their careers and helping them pay coaches' salaries, pay for their gear, pay for their clubs, which are super expensive, pay for greens fees, pay for tournament registrations. All that stuff is part of what sponsors pay for. And even at the highest level, the purse that they win, they're paying for the prize money that's also provided by corporate sponsors in the event from the tournaments themselves. When they sponsor a major tournament like the Masters for the PGA or things like that, I guess the Masters isn't a PGA event, but when there's a tournament like the Masters, there are sponsors associated with that and other championships around the country throughout the year. Corporate sponsorship helps pay for some of the fees, which is partially for the reason why those purses skyrocketed over the past 25 years, because with all the additional exposure with a golfer attracting all of that attention, once the broadcast values started increasing and the advertising rates started increasing, then the sponsorship value started increasing, and then that increases how much the players are able to earn in a given year. And those are sort of a cascade effect of how the sport suddenly was supercharged. And it all starts at that early level where it sounds like, and I heard a similar thing from a golfer I played with that was on the UNLV team, who was brought into a charity tournament that I played with a client, and he was brought in, as the CEO said, as the ringer. He's the guy that knows how to play, that was on the CEO's team, so he was guaranteed to win the scramble, the 18-hole scramble. And he said the same thing when the CEO asked him, why didn't you ever turn pro? And he said, the difference between me and everybody else that would turn pro is shooting a 65 versus a 66.
Yeah, it's
and he said that last 1% is so incredibly difficult to achieve. You said that's the bar. You get to a certain point, and unless you can get that extra 1% that puts you above everybody else, then you're not going to make it. And that's sort of the journey that he went on too in his career.
You've got 125 guys on the PGA Tour every year. You've got 125 guys on the Korn Ferry Tour, which is the second tour, right? And you have to finish in, and I'm going to get this wrong, I should probably look this up, but you have to finish in the top 25 of the Korn Ferry Tour to move up to the PGA Tour. And I think you have to finish within the top 75 on the PGA Tour to maintain your card. And so if you don't, it's relegation, right? And so it's the same thing on the Korn Ferry Tour. If you don't finish in the top half of the field or whatever it is, you're back down playing in Q school, which is what McAvoy goes through in this movie to make the U.S. Open. He has to go through a regional qualifier and then the sectional qualifier, and then get in. But Q school is 3 rounds, so you have first stage, second stage, final stage.
Okay,
and each of those stages only like 15 people move on.
Wow.
I mean, the competition is insane. You'll talk to guys and they will say, I will do anything I have to possibly do to avoid going to Q school, because there's so many of these players out there. Like you mentioned, the guy you played with that had played at UNLV, unbelievable player. He could probably go through Q school and make it, but if he's having an off week, he's not going to make it. Right. And then once you do make it, if you're not making cuts, you don't get paid. So you're playing in the tournaments. If you're not top 60 in ties, you're not playing the weekend and you don't get any tournament winnings, right?
Yeah.
So you're hoping that your sponsors are paying for your travel, your hotels, food, all that expenses that you have on the road. I think a lot of people, they get blinded by the poshness of these top tier PGA Tour guys that are flying on private jets and staying in crazy houses in Augusta for every year for the Masters. And that's just not the reality. Exactly. It's not the reality. It's not what's going on. Even on the PGA Tour, you got guys driving around the country in Winnebagos and sharing hotel rooms on the road, and
which still happens apparently. They still take the Winnebagos on the road and sleep in them at tournaments. That's amazing to me.
Yeah, it's because it's expensive, man, and they're not. you as a PGA Tour player, you are running your own business. You are your own business, right? And if you're not placing or getting results, you're not getting paid. And the results is what also will bring in those higher sponsorship dollars. In the early part of your career, you're going to get these small local companies that'll throw you a few bucks. But if you play well enough, those bucks start to get bigger. They start talking to parent companies. You start growing that sponsorship. Because you'll look at guys like Tiger and these top tier PGA guys, they'll only have one or two sponsors on their clothing, right? Because those sponsors are paying them enough that they don't need to go out and NASCAR themselves, right? You know, I love the shirt that Roy wears in the first round of the U.S. Open in the movie. He's got this huge logo on the front. He's got a logo here. He's got logos on both sleeves, and then in the bar scene after, you notice that there's a giant logo on the back too.
Yeah, you can see it when he tees off after he takes his windbreaker off, and on the back he says it's Brink and Brown Sanitation Experts, which looks like it's a Salome, Texas company. So and then he tags it in the press conference after, I believe it's the third round, going into the fourth round that night when he shoots the course record. So that'll be a nice segue into our first category, which is logo soup. So we've talked about a few of the brands that are there. It's Nissan when he's at his charity tournament for David Sims. And then in tournament play, it's Infinity. And then I had expected the US Open would have more sponsor recognition. Just talking about logo soup, just talking about the environment in general. Again, I suppose shame on me looking backwards, applying how I look at golf now and what a tournament looks like now, that there would at least be some of the same elements there in 95. That doesn't seem like it was 50 years ago. Yeah. So I'm looking for I went so far as to go on YouTube and rewatch the 1995 US Open, and there weren't sponsor breaks. Greg Norman, when he finished his round at par in the fourth round, and he walks by all of the television cameras and he goes back behind, I believe you'd call it the grandstand, and he's interviewed by television reporters, and there isn't a single brand all the way back there. And in this film, I didn't see a lot of branding opportunities for even just general sponsorship elements that now you would probably see sold a la carte. There's, I guess it's a telescopic device that Doreen is using during the fourth round to watch the players, and it just says US Open on it. Like, that would be integrated either into a sponsorship, or it would just be its own thing where a company received recognition to pay for all those and they just gave them to the tournament. Yeah, right. But that kind of stuff I expected to see more of, and I didn't. And so then my thinking was, well, I'm going to go back and watch the actual US Open and see what brands were there. They did have sponsors, but it wasn't as mature or relevant to how they would do it today. And even now, television exposure isn't necessarily the most valuable thing. A lot of what I've read, and this has been true for other films that we've done then and now, and sponsorships that we've talked about then and now, is most of the value is being derived on social because of the value and the connection that it brings directly to the audience. And that's something that television exposure to a broader audience doesn't necessarily have. So there isn't as much value in the television exposure now as there was in 1996, but for completely different reasons, if that makes any sense.
Well, even like if you watch like just a random PGA Tour event, like let's take the I can't remember what the tournament this last week was, but there's not any really big names playing in it. You watch that compared to the Masters, and you look at the branding that's going on at just a random run-of-your-mill PGA event. There's ads everywhere. They've got stuff around tee boxes. They've got stuff on the grandstands. They've got stuff anywhere they can put a logo. There's a logo. Yep. You look at the Masters, there's no branding there besides the Masters. And that's an intentional choice on their part to keep the brand of the Masters this pristine thing, right? Yep. And so one of the things that popped in my mind when you were talking about there wasn't any U.S. Open brand recognition, I'm wondering, like, was there licensing issues that the U.S. Open didn't want to be associated with some random movie, or was there something else that was going on behind the scenes that they just were like, you know what? You can use the name in the in the dialogue, but let's not put logos anywhere. I mean, it's interesting to think through the thought process of that on the property side of things, right?
Yeah, and I wonder if that could be something we talk about when we get into missed opportunities, and I suppose we're talking about it now, because this is the second Ron Shelton film that we've done, the other being White Men Can't Jump. And in White Men Can't Jump, there are brands associated with basketball at higher levels that are recognized courtside during a tournament in the film. But in the end credits, when they're going through acknowledgments and thank you, and that's usually where they'll tag the American Humane Association, monitoring the film and any promotional consideration and any licensing issues. That's always at the end of the end credits where they tag all that. And I tend to stick around through those things to look for that, just because
only you would know that, Ross. I don't even know that.
I'm a geek. Well, thank you. I will tell you, I did it for 10 Cup. So I did that. I took one for the team and sat through the end credits of 10 Cup last night. Yeah. So there isn't, it's the same thing as there was in White Men Can't Jump. There isn't any note of promotional consideration received by any of the brands in the film. And I don't know the answer to your question, but think it's plausible that there was either a licensing issue or the brands didn't want to be recognized on screen other than the ones that are. And if they were, it's hard to say, and that's one of the questions we always have is, did any money actually change hands when there's a real company sponsoring a fictional property from a film? And in this case, there was, but it doesn't seem like there was any money involved or in that transaction, because there would have been some sort of acknowledgement at the end of the film where the producers are thanking everybody that helped make the film. There's nothing there.
The other level of complexity to it too is the driving range scenes, right? You've got Johnny Miller on the range. You have all these actual pro golfers that show up in the film.
Yep.
And so are they repping the brands that are actually sponsoring them? And are those brands having to pay to be in the movie, right? It's kind of that weird, like, how do you, and this is something that I run into all the time with exclusive rights on campus and things like that. It's like, where do you make exceptions and who has to pay for what? And so I saw that and was like, okay, Johnny Miller's wearing a Callaway hat, and some guys won't wear hats in movies because their sponsors aren't paying them for the extra appearances, right? And so they're like, well, yeah, I'm not going to throw them a bone if they're not going to pay me for it.
Yep.
And I think that goes back to the relationship, right? It's like, if you have a great relationship with your sponsor, you're going to just do it because they're treating you well, right? It's not going to come down to, oh, I'm not going to wear that because, and you saw this with Jason Duffner. He wears a hat with dude wipes on it now. He was sponsored by Titleist, I believe.
Yep.
And they kind of wrote him off when he had a really good run at the Masters. It was probably 2011 or 12. And after that, he kind of fell off the face. He didn't really place in any tournaments or anything. And so his sponsors kind of wrote him off. And so he said, all right, fine. I'm not going to wear your logo on a hat anymore. I don't have an exclusive right with that. I don't have it signed anywhere. Now he's repped by Dude Wipes.
Which is a
great fit. I mean, his personality, it's a great fit for him.
And it's not dissimilar from how McAvoy partners with brands from his own town to support his run at the US Open, because it's not too different from the relationship he has with Golden Tassel, where it's not typically a brand that you would see on a golf course, but back to our point about congruity, it seems like, if anyone has interest in researching congruence as it relates to sponsorship, there's been pages and pages of studies done over the past, say, 30 or 40 years into the influence that it has on a relationship between a brand and a sponsored property or someone that is selling the rights to the sponsorship. And incongruity can raise immediate awareness because it creates a disconnect in the mind of the consumer that's at the event, where they would say, not that there's a disconnect here, but if they looked at that and said, why is Dude Wipes on the visor? And it detracts interest that way. And especially on social now, if it's humorous in nature or it's so off the wall that it creates a sort of incongruence, it'll get an immediate sort of bump or uplift around the time of the event. But long term, the synergy between values, mission, locality, all those things really add value long term between a brand and a property. And so it sort of works both ways depending on what you're trying to do. So for someone like Dude Wipes, or say the Golden Tassel, or I would think in this case, Brink and Brown Sanitation Experts, despite being a local company, which we should go through these, but those types of brands you wouldn't typically see on a golf course, but it's also just for 4 rounds of golf at the US Open, which is going to generate the type of exposure that they maybe need. And maybe that turns into something long-term, because it is congruent in that it aligns with who McAvoy is, both as a person, as a golfer, and where he's from in the United States. All those brands make sense. And we'll go through the list here, but they have the potential for long-term engagement, but they're not necessarily just a one and done thing, but they could be depending on what those brands want to do around him.
A real world example of this that went terribly wrong was Bubba Watson signing with Volvic, right? He signed this deal. He's got this colorful personality, so he starts playing these super bright golf balls, and he doesn't place in tournaments, and he goes back to Pro V1, he goes back to Titleist, and he wins the first tournament when he goes back to Titleist. So there goes Volvic's run into trying to be a legitimate golf company, right?
Yeah, it's a big backfire.
It's a big backfire.
Well, speaking of backfire and sanitation, not to make a pun, let's look at McAvoy's sponsors, because he does piecemeal it, and I think that'll relate when we get into fees and what the ROI for these companies. But these are all, to my knowledge, either Texas or Salome, Texas companies. So the Visor, I think this will be called our second missed opportunity. The Visor is the Tin Cup fan club. Yeah. Now, the Visor, as we'll talk about, is the most valuable piece of real estate that a golfer has now to offer to sponsors, because it receives the highest level of exposure, significantly higher. So it's Tin Cup Fan Club, but that's unsold. He has Rio Grande, as he calls it, or Rio Grande Short Haul Trucking, which is the big logo that he has on the front of his shirt. Yep. He also has the front left-hand pocket, so the left breast is Wally's Smokehouse. And then on the left sleeve, which for a right-handed golfer like McAvoy gets more exposure than the right sleeve. So the left sleeve is State Bank of Salome, and then on the right sleeve is 20 Winks Motel, which you see at the very start of the film when they're sort of giving the lay of the land of Salome, Texas. You see Waffle House, and you see 20 Winks Motel. And then the back of the shirt is Brink and Brown Sanitation Experts, which you don't really see until he takes his first swing and he's watching the ball fly off the first tee, and you can see that on the back. And then you see it in the bar when he makes the bet, which I have some questions for you as that relates to etiquette. And then the bag, of course, is Golden Tassel. So in contemporary golf, when a golfer has this many logos in terms of recognition, and generally from the research that I've done, and I would certainly love to get your opinion on this, as you know, from your experience, but from what I've read in terms of just overall exposure value, the list goes starting from top down. Number one location for exposure for a brand associated with a golfer during a tournament is the hat or the visor. Number two is the shirt. And then the bag side panel, which is the Golden Tassel logo. Although I would argue that it's more valuable than a general bag side panel, because the club covers also have golden tassels on them. So I feel like that's a nice add-on. Then the left sleeve, the right sleeve, the side of the headwear, the back of the headwear. So if you look at that 1995 US Open, actually, if you look at Pavin's side of his cap, he actually sold the left side of his cap, and then the back is called the yoke. And there's a very famous therapeutic wrap, the brand name, which is escaping me, maybe you know, that Tiger wore on his neck, that wasn't a paid sponsorship, but received a ton of exposure from him just using those wraps. Yeah, the heat tape on the back of his neck. Yeah, that wasn't even an endorsement, but it received a ton of exposure because it was on Tiger's neck. So
local Utah company right there.
Yeah.
KT tape.
And so the idea there is, you know, these sponsors, some of them that he has are unsold, and not certain, you know, from your experience, what you've seen pretty typically, but it seems like the rest of the 1995 US Open, at least in the film, the rest of the players were what you were describing earlier, which is they have a big sponsor on the visor or the hat, and then they have a big sponsor on the pocket, And then the bag is typically an endemic sponsor where they're providing the club. So it's a Titleist or a TaylorMade, which TaylorMade actually was promotional paid consideration for the film. But that tends to be pretty common. And then all the other stuff is add-on if there are brands that are interested in it.
So even if you look at pro golf today, Nike players, the vast majority of them don't have another sponsor on their shirts. Nike's paying them to keep other people off of their shirt. And you noticed just this last year, Nike added a swoosh to the back shoulder here because what you said, if you're a right-handed golfer, that left arm's getting more exposure. So when players, they found when they swing through the ball, they expose their back, and there's now a Nike swoosh there on all their shirts because of the TV exposure, right? So I said earlier, McAvoy NASCAR'd himself up. Because that's something that gets thrown out a lot on college campuses is we don't want to NASCAR the campus. And I'm like, okay, that's great. So you have to find things that make sense, right? And so, sorry, I'm probably way off base here, Ross. What am I talking about?
No, I hear that all the time too. And when I've consulted with other universities, that's usually what we lead with is no one's trying to NASCAR up your campus. No one's trying to make it look like a professional sports event. We use a lot of analogies like that because of this sort of resistance to having logos all over the place. However, the thing that is taken out of context, and we did this in sort of our introductory episode as it relates to NASCAR fans, that's how teams are paid and are able to play in that sport is the sponsors pay for everything. They don't get money from other parts of the league. There isn't any other income stream. The sponsors help the teams and the drivers compete at the level that they compete at. So the fans that understand that because it's part of the DNA of the sport love sponsors, and they have huge brand loyalty to the sponsors that support their particular racing team and that sport in general. So it's a different type of environment than, say, a college campus where brands can be seen as intrusive if it's not built and structured and supporting the audience in the proper way. And it's a different type of engagement around the audiences that a college campus offers. As I'm sure you know better than me, I worked at UNLV, and that was part of what I would say internally is there are ways that we can engage brands with the audience that isn't necessarily we're going to put a sign on a professor's forehead, which was always the joke. We're not going to do that to NASCAR up the campus, but there are ways to create meaningful engagement. It just looks different in NASCAR, but it's used as the prime example.
Yeah. No, makes sense.
Let's look at the assets. So this is a question I had for you, Joe. I'm just going to start with it because it relates to all the other assets. So he has basically a windbreaker pullover that he wears for the first round when he's hungover. He takes it off. He's got a polo underneath that looks exactly the same. And he has the golden tassel bag with his clubs in it, with the club covers that also have golden tassels on it. And for the first round, he's teeing off. I think Romeo tells them they're teeing off at 7:05 in the morning. They're the first ones on the course. There's nobody else out there except I think the folks working the tournament. It doesn't look like there's a huge audience, but he wears all of his stuff that first day. Then on the second day, he doesn't wear anything for his second round.
I noticed the same thing.
Third round, he does a press conference with his windbreaker on. And then the fourth round, nobody's there, but the only one that's consistent across, and I created like this little chart to see where sponsors were. But aside from the windbreaker, he doesn't bring back the polo, but the golden tassel is the only sponsorship that's consistent from round to round across those 4 days. Do you know why he would have given all of his sponsors recognition on the first day? Because in terms of missed opportunities, the legendary round 3 seems like that's a huge miss for all those brands that he's working with.
I had the exact same thought, and I have no idea why, other than aesthetics, that the movie did that. Because that third round was when he had all the TV exposure, right? And then the first round, he goes out and fires an 83. And I love the line at the end when they're sitting in the bar and Sim's asks, how does a great ball striker like you go out and shoot an 83? He says, well, I missed a 4-foot putt on 18 for an 82.
Yep.
I love that. But anyway, I saw that same thing, and I'm going, and I was like, maybe he's wearing a sweater and it's underneath. It wasn't. I have no idea why he would do that, and I'm guessing today that would be some sort of a breach of contract on his part with the sponsors, and they would give him a call and be like, "We're not paying you.
Right.
We'll pay you a third of what we were going to pay you for this tournament because that is all you wore."
Yeah, we're paying you for 4 days of exposure, the entire tournament, and we receive recognition on your 83, but not on your 65 on day 3, and not on your legendary 12 on 18.
Right. Whole out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
the other perspective to take on it too, though, is those companies were such small companies that they may just be happy to have anything, right? I'm sure they're probably kicking themselves going, "Oh man, I wish we would have had it. I wish we would have had that TV exposure." But at the same time, was that something that they were actually expecting to get?
Yeah. I would lean towards it's probably not related to the exposure and more to their support of McAvoy, and also given how we'll call it hustles. And he uses the word hustle at the start of the film when he's referring to all the golf paraphernalia to help with Rene Russo's swing. And he said, you don't recognize a hustle when you see one. And then I think within a scene or two, he's at Doreen's Golden Tassel establishment trying to offer the deed to his golf range so that he can pay off a debt. And then she lowballs him a little bit to get a little bit of extra value out of it. And so I think he has a good nature about him going to these local brands saying, because of who he is with the beer stained undershirt and all that stuff that they talk about in the film. When my wife watched it, she said, Roy McAvoy looks like he smells. I would have to agree with that, especially early on, that he would go in, being himself, and they would give him money to see him be successful, because like everybody that watches this, and sort of the point of the film is the underdog can't succeed on his own terms, and everybody sees that in him, but he just hasn't achieved it on his own yet or doesn't believe it himself. And that's sort of the arc that McAvoy goes on. But the sponsors would likely see that in them. And it goes back to what we were saying sort of at the top of the podcast is, do they see potential in this particular athlete? Is there a long-term opportunity for engagement? Are they going to be successful? Is there television coverage? I think for those sponsors that we mentioned that are on that shirt, I don't think they're there necessarily for the long-term exposure potential, but they want McAvoy to succeed, their hometown athlete on this tour. And he's sort of the anti-golf, anti-establishment golfer.
Yeah.
Not quite to the extent that, say, Happy Gilmore is in that film, but very similar to disrupting not only the sponsors that are on a golf course at that time, but also what's happening on the golf course and the way that he plays, and aggressively versus playing it safe, which is sort of a thematic element to the movie too. But all of that sort of ties into his persona and who he is as a golfer. And I think that's why those brands are there, at least in my opinion, to answer your question. But there is one pretty big miss here, just in terms of assets. So it's largely exposure driven. It's logos on his person and on his uniform while he's on the course. Largely the asset is McAvoy's person, where he's providing recognition during the tournament broadcast. But he does have that one moment at the podium, which I quoted at the top of the podcast, where they're asking him about low percentage shots, and he self-identifies as, I am too, look at who the brands are and who I'm playing for. And he starts listing all of them, one of them being the State Bank of Salome. He mentions Brink and Brown. And then his left chest sponsor, which is Wally's Smokehouse. And I'm certain this is a slip up by Kevin Costner, the actor, but he calls it Woody's Smokehouse, not Wally's. So I feel like in terms of losing value and missed opportunities, Wally's Smokehouse, I think, definitely lost out on that. They were only present on the worst round he played. And then when they get the press conference after he shoots his legendary 65, he calls them by the wrong name. That's a pretty big faux pas. And I think there'd be some clawbacks to the sponsorship money they provided just for that alone.
I see this with NIL, which is funny. You'll have players in a press conference talking about NIL. And this is a real example. I won't use any names or anything to put anybody on the spot, but
sure,
the players speaking couldn't tell. He was leading a panel on NIL, and he could not name a single person that had given him money.
Wow.
He didn't know
That's
a
like
single
winning an
deal.
Oscar and not naming anybody who got you there.
I'm sitting in there going, holy crap, I'm glad no one from the brands that are repping him are in this room right now, because we would have a big old problem.
So this is another example which helps illustrate what you just said too, not around name, image, likeness, but around professional sports. So there was we'll call them an IT company that sponsors the National Football League. And especially during the pandemic and beforehand, one of their devices was the official device of the NFL. And people would go on and use the competitor's name, which was in marketing, you'd call it a category killer. They got up and they used a general term. It's like getting up and saying, if you're repping Burt's Beeswax, and you get up and you say, I brought my chapstick with me. Those are two different brands, but people generally refer to lip balm as chapstick, and that's called a category killer for those of you who aren't familiar with that type of phenomenon. But this happened with a major partner for the NFL, and they had to keep reminding them that every time somebody says that, they're actually providing recognition for a competitor because their product competes with that particular device. And it was really frustrating for the brand team because they didn't know how to correct it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the sponsorship, you're dealing with people at the end of the day. I mean, one of my favorite things, and this is down in your neck of the woods with the Knights, is Ed Bernstein used to be a huge sponsor of the Golden Knights. And I think he sponsored the power play or the penalty kill. I can't remember. And we'd get on the PA and say, your Knights are on an Ed Bernstein power play. And everyone would yell, Ed Bernstein sucks.
Oh, man.
In the whole arena. Needless to say, he doesn't sponsor the Knights anymore.
That's unfortunate. That's not the kind of recognition you want.
I think the end of the day, like you look at the sponsors that McAvoy has in that movie compared to what these polished athletes had, and that's just what you have to deal with, because these big brands don't want to have that kind of problem. They don't want to mess with the unknown and the personality and that kind of stuff. The only company I know that did it really, really well was Nike, and it was when they were doing ads with Andre Agassi. They did the big one with Brandi Chastain after she pulled her shirt off at the World Cup. Serena Williams, Tiger, they've done an unbelievable job of embracing that, the anti-hero, right? They're embracing
iconic
they're
classics.
Embracing the disruption, embracing the anti-hero, and they're bringing that whole new sector to the market, right?
And Colin Kaepernick too.
And Colin Kaepernick. Yep, exactly.
Well, is it fair to say then, from what you've seen, that brands are more risk averse, depending on what their brand ethos is and culturally what they represent? And this goes back to, when we were exchanging emails last night, I think I said I'm happy to just talk about congruence this entire time. But one of the things is they call it self-congruity. It's when a person recognizes or has a sense of self in what they represent, and they tend to support brands that have that same thing. And so when they see them at an event that they're passionate about because the brand matches their identity, when they see a sponsor there tends to be a warmer connection with that particular brand because of what they call self-congruity. And so there are some brands that try and tie into that more than others and are willing to take risks more than others. I think it really depends on the property, because they're trying to create an authentic connection and are worried that doing that could risk reputational damage. We've talked about that on this podcast before. Backing an athlete or talent or endorsing talent that has a risk to potentially damage their brand. There's a lot of things that they have to think about going into that process to make sure that they want to support the property or the person or the athlete in the right way, the talent in the right way, but they also want to make sure that if anything goes sideways on them for some reason in the relationship on both sides, that both parties are protected when it doesn't work. And there's examples of that in pro golf too, like you had mentioned earlier, where there are relationships that just end either because an athlete decided to go with Liv Mickelson,
Right.
when he moved over to Live, he lost a couple of sponsors. When Tiger Woods had some personal issues, he lost some sponsors. And you see that throughout pro sports. But then there are some brands that stand by, or, one of Mickelson's partners paused their relationship but didn't terminate it, that will continue to stand by them. I think it really depends on who the brand is and sort of what they stand for.
I think a good example of this too is Nike with Tiger, how they handled Tiger and how they handled Lance Armstrong. And it goes back to how strong of a relationship those athletes had with people at that brand, right? The legend goes, I don't know how true this is, but when I was up at Nike, somebody told me this, and they said, well, I asked, I go, well, why is Lance's name being taken off of everything, but Tiger gets a pass? He's good to go. And they said, well, Tiger came to Phil and said, look, this is going to come out. This is what's about to happen. This is what's going down. These are the things that are going to happen. And they said that Lance Armstrong never did that. And so Nike got blindsided by the bad press and everything going on there, right? Which, I mean, depending on your ethics and your morals, one thing was way worse than the other. I don't care where you stand on that, but it came down to how strong of a relationship those athletes had with the leadership at those company, at the company, where they went, you know what, we're behind you 100%. Thank you for coming to us and letting us know. Or you didn't tell us, we had no idea this was coming. We were blindsided. We're done. We're writing you off. We don't want anything to do with you anymore.
Yep. And that's an important takeaway that's come out of a couple of discussions that we've had, which is communication, right? Partnership in any form is a two-way street. We've talked about that a couple times on this podcast. We've used a couple examples, but really communication is a key aspect to whether a partnership can survive when you run into situations like that, which is they gave them a heads up. Can you support us as we go through this? Or whether the brand is blindsided. And certainly the previous example is the better way to go, which is communicate with your partners and try and work through those issues together and don't let them get blindsided in that sort of circumstance. Tends to be a good best practice.
When I work with coaching clients on the fairways side of things, I go through 3 pillars of what creates a strong relationship. And the first one is genuine curiosity. Be genuinely curious about people, what they have to teach you. Be open-minded, right? Everybody you meet has something new to teach you.
I love that.
The second thing is have a win-win mentality. And that to me is the key tenet to partnerships, is having a win-win mentality and making sure that your partners are coming out as big of a win, if not bigger than you are, which then leads into the third pillar, which is selfless service, right? Do things just because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to gain anything from it. And if you can master those 3 things, you're going to build relationships and create connections with people that are going to pay dividends in ways that you could never even imagine down the road. Things that you couldn't plan for. Someone's going to come to you. I mean, honestly, Ross, we're sitting here because I was in Vegas one day and was like, I need someone to play golf with. I'm going to reach out to Ross and go play golf, right?
Yeah.
I had no expectations. I had nothing on the table, no reason to be there other than getting to know you as a person, right?
Likewise.
And now we're sitting here having a good time chatting about funny movies.
That's right.
It's those 3 things that in every aspect of life, like if you can carry those within yourself, like you're going to be a successful person. You're going to build successful partnerships, and you're going to have partners that want to just continually renew with you because they enjoy working with you so much. They'll forego some of that exposure, some of the return, because they know that they're going to get the consistent experience. They've got that strong relationship, and that you're going to go to bat with them for them if something ever does go wrong.
I think that is an amazing philosophy, and that those are the core tenets of the type of training that you provide and the services that you provide to support the overall, I guess, philosophy of the company. I think is an amazing lesson for folks that are your clients and that you work with. And I reserve the right to maybe take this out of the recording, but I will share this.
You're good.
As it relates to what you just said, I have a friend that said, no relationships are truly equal. There's always one party out of the 2 that's more invested than the other. But if you try to keep score, then it's not going to last. So you have to assume that the other party is more invested than you and do everything you can to make them happy. And if people treated every coupling relationship or sponsorship that way, all of them would have a better chance at success, because that's a good philosophy to live by. And when you mentioned win-win scenario, that was the first thing that popped in my head, was my friend's words from 15 years ago, where I think there's a lot of truth in making sure that you're servicing and making sure that the person you're working with and the partner that you're working with are happy. And I think, and that they're being fulfilled in the right ways. And in sponsorship, that has one connotation, and the rest of life it has another, but that is still a good rule to live by. And the best partnerships are able to build from that, whether it's personal relationships on the golf course or it's a business relationship where you're both trying to get a certain type of value out of it, and they last for 20, 25 years. And I think that's an important, maybe the most important takeaway we've had on this podcast, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you sharing that.
I get a little philosophical sometimes, so if it's too much.
Oh, no, you just wait till we get to food for thought. I don't really have a random thought for this one, but, you can't be too philosophical on this podcast. And, we're all philosophical guys, so wax on. So let's go into, just quickly, I wanted to go into touch into false market value, and I'd love to get your take on this. I mentioned earlier at the top of the podcast, I had a question for you about this. And, some of the questions we ask are, all right, so if this were a real deal in 1996, or as it's portrayed in the film, 1995, I saw a lot of references to 1995. So I'm assuming released in 96, but this is 1995 fictionally.
Right.
What would sponsors pay to have that type of exposure with Roy McAvoy, that particular athlete? And then now, what would that look like? Now, we've already touched on a lot of that, but we haven't really driven into the dollars and cents. So I'm curious. I have some metrics that I'll share about just exposure value, which I did a little bit of digging over the past couple of days to see if we could at least come up with a number. And then I think I haven't answered your question about Monster Energy, and I'd like to get your take on that. And I think we can sort of land on a number for that. But in 1995, we had talked about cost to travel from Salome, Texas, all the way to North Carolina, which they take a Winnebago for. And just, at that time, gas prices aren't what they are now, but it still wasn't inexpensive to fill up a Winnebago and drive it across the country. You have entry fees. So what do you think, knowing how we've tiered all those sponsors that are on McAvoy's, call it uniform, what he presents on the golf course, what do you think those would be worth, or what, more importantly, do you think those sponsors paid?
Oh man, I ran some numbers on the bag and what Doreen should have, what I think Doreen actually paid to get Golden Tassel on the bag.
Oh, I can't wait to hear.
So he owed her $12,000, right? And she says, "Well, let's call it 10." And then that's a great scene. Romeo's he's negotiating salaries. Well, the picker boy gets $5 an hour, and
well, then later they say that McAvoy's the pro gets $7, which is incredible. But
it's so funny. But anyway, he pawns his golf clubs for $400.
Okay.
And so I have to think that she paid to get her name on the bag so he could get his golf clubs back. And then he breaks a set of clubs. Yep. And so he's got to replace all of his clubs. So there's another 96, you're probably $400 or $500 for another set of clubs.
And he doesn't have an equipment sponsor either. So it's probably a mixed bag, right? He just bought whatever to throw in there.
Yep. He's out of pocket. I'm guessing she wrote off the debt of $12,000 and then paid for that extra set of clubs. And so it was about $12,500.
So you think $12,500 all in. So, and then does that include the cost of the bag? Because you know that those bag cover tassels are custom. So do you think that would have increased the price? I'm
guessing she paid. Yeah, that covered that. So we'll go up to 13 for the bag sponsorship.
Okay. And then what do you think in 1995, just in terms of value that she gets out of that? And that was what I had mentioned to you when we first started talking about this, is wouldn't it be fun to figure out what her actual ROI would have been on whatever she invested? So let's call it $12,500. What do you think the exposure value, being the only sponsor for all 4 days, going on the run that he goes on in the 1995 US Open, fictionally in North Carolina, what do you think that value would be? Because I ran a few numbers to come up with a couple different ways we could do this.
You'd have to figure she gets probably 8 to 10 minutes of TV exposure with that. And so you'd figure what was a 30-second spot running at the US Open in 1996.
Yeah.
That's how I would look at TV exposure.
It's exactly
I have
how
no
I looked
idea
at
what
it.
that number would. I have no idea what that number would be.
All right, so here's a few real metrics that were measured by another sponsorship agency that acts as a broker for sponsors and finding properties. It's another agency, and they put out a graphic that sort of showed just some general measurements for pro athlete recognition, and it's a single athlete with different types of recognition. So the sleeve, which is also on different types of pro sports, the visor, which is specifically in golf, the back of the shirt, the collar, the shorts, the logo on the shorts. So they broke it all down just in terms of average exposure value. So they did the hat and the sleeve for exposure time. And so the hat for one day was 390 minutes. And then the right sleeve was 37 seconds per day of total exposure, because a golf tournament on average this past year was 4 hours and 40 minutes, I think. And they said a golfer gets about an hour of that. And then the sponsor recognition, say for a hat or a visor, is 390 seconds per day of the tournament. And then the sleeve is about 37 seconds. So equivalent roughly to 1 30-second spot of exposure. So I had estimated, so based on that, so 390 seconds for the hat. I had the shirt, so the trucking company on the front of a shirt, I had that just given the size of the logo at about 300, so a little bit less. And then I had the bag side panel, which, as we talked about at the top, is sort of third in the tier of recognition, around 250, which would be a little bit more than 4 minutes total exposure time. But given the tassels, and this was something I had mentioned too, you can see the tassels even if you can't see her logo. So maybe 8 seconds is right. So I can certainly, let's go ahead and double that, because I'm just curious to see what it would be. So the ad rate for CBS Sports in 2023, which broadcast the US Open in 1995, even though that wasn't the actual network. So CBS's ad rate, it gets complicated. We're talking about fictional properties, but let's just go. Let's just say it's CBS. So, so it's 88,000 is the spot on CBS Sports now. So if you look at how ad rates have grown over the years, and I know there's going to be some wonky things in there simply because of the accelerated rate at which rates and exposure happened after 1996, so post Tiger era. But if you back that to 1995, I had it estimated somewhere in the $25,000 to $30,000 range. So that would mean the bag side panel, if we say it's 500 seconds, so twice what you would typically get for a bag side panel, that would be total exposure value across all 4 days would be a little less than 1.9 million total exposure value across those 4 days. Dollars. And I think that's a $95 in that's today's dollars.
Oh, geez. Nice. You got a great deal.
Now it would be closer to 6 million exposure value with the increased ad rates. So, I suppose it's same dollar value. We're not accounting for the change in value of money over time, but we are accounting for the change in ad rates over time. So based on ad rates in 95, it'd be about 1.8 if we're assuming she gets 500 seconds of exposure per round for 4 days. And now that'd be closer to 6. So
nice.
If she is, and I had a similar mindset of you, which I was thinking it's got to be 10,000, because it seems like she has that kind of money laying around, and the transaction at the start, I think 12.5 sounds good. Yeah. So her ROI is astronomical on that deal. So she really made out. And in terms of missed opportunities, if he would have sold the hat, let's say we'll go with 390 seconds per day. If he had sold a hat, wore it every single day for 4 days, minimum, he's looking at $1.5 million. He probably could have asked just in the exposure value for having a logo on his visor or his hat during that tournament. And it would have been even many multiples above that because of the legendary 65, because that's going to run forever, right?
It makes you wonder, though, because it's like you can't guarantee that kind of exposure.
No.
I mean, you watch a PGA event these days and you watch maybe it's like 8 guys and then they'll throw a random shot in of somebody else, right?
Yep.
And so it's like, how do you as a brand figure out what you should be paying for that?
And that's where it comes into, when I have done valuations on the agency side in the past, one of the things that we account for is earned media value, because what you have to look at, and we've talked about this on this podcast before, is that will often get worked in as a line item if they know what the actual exposure value is of all that earned media coverage. But for something like that legendary round, for example, day 3 of the 95 US Open, there's going to be a ton of press in the modern era on social, probably a 2-week, 3-week, maybe a month-long cycle where that's just getting pushed everywhere. And so the exposure value of that round for sponsors in the year it happens is astronomical. After that, it starts to degrade. It's not the same level of sponsorship over time. Right? So you can't necessarily work that into year 1 of an agreement. So it's more accounted for as what you'd call a qualitative assessment or a qualitative value to sponsorship that isn't necessarily, you take an X% of it and you try and put it in as an annual contract, because it is, as you mentioned, unpredictable. You don't necessarily know how a golfer's career is going to go, but there is a certain amount of risk on the sponsor's side if you believe in something's going to happen, because that works both ways. They could be a bust and you don't get the same value that you're paying for it because they don't win any tournaments, or they could have a McAvoy moment where you're incorporating their brand for the rest of the time. And that's where they say it is like buying stock. It's the likelihood of receiving that value over time and the chance for them to grow, which I think is one of the more tricky aspects of sponsorship valuation, is figuring out that exact thing, which is what's the earned media value from the qualitative side. And it really factors into who the athlete is and sort of all these other qualitative things like, the prestigiousness of the golfer and the opportunity for exposure and working with other sponsors. All that stuff starts to play a role.
This plays into the question I asked you about Tiger's bag sponsorship with Monster Energy, right? Yeah. He gets that sponsorship in 2018, I think.
16,
I
believe.
Okay. But he comes out and has that and wins the Masters, right? Against all odds, right? Yep. And Monster's just cleaning up on the exposure by having the black bag with the green branding out there, right? And this is when he's coming back from back surgery, right?
Yep.
They were the big sponsor for his comeback, right? So he's getting all that TV time, all that time on Sports Center, and all that time on Golf Channel with, they're showing videos of him hitting golf balls in his backyard, and there's this Monster Energy bag sitting next to him. It's like, yep. I've been trying to figure out what they paid for that or what they should have paid for that, and I have had no luck.
Okay. Should have paid. That's a tougher question, obviously.
Yeah. Well, how do you? Well, it goes back to what you were just talking about, though. Is like, how do you plan for him to win the Masters? That, I mean, I want to look up what his odds were, but they were astronomical.
Well, I know that depending on the nature of the sponsorship seller or property, if there's an opportunity for, say, a team to make the playoffs in multiple years, and this happens for. The first example that pops to mind is NFL player contracts. If you're into the postseason, there's a bonus. If you win a championship, there's a bonus. There's certain sorts of financial compensation there. I think there is the ability for additional value as someone selling sponsorship if you have a legendary run in some way. I've seen those types of considerations before, but it's less common, and part of the risk with sponsorship versus advertising, which is sort of well known in the industry, that when you buy an ad, you control exactly what you're saying and where it's going to. When you sponsor an athlete like Roy McAvoy, you're investing in the potential of what he can deliver, but it's not a guarantee. So there's more risk involved with sponsorship than there is with, say, just buying an ad during the US Open that year.
Right. He was 60-1. No, wait, sorry. That was Patrick Reed and Sergio. I got to find it because the odds were crazy that he actually pulled that off. And it's one of the greatest golf moments of all time.
Well, according to an SEC filing by Muscle Farm, so they had a 2-year agreement that ran from July of 14 through June of 2016. But the deal ended in March of 16. So from July 14 through March of 2016, Tiger was paid $7 million by Muscle Farm. Then he had 3 months left on the second year of the contract, I believe, at least from the SEC filing, and Tiger was paid $2.5 million to end that contract early. So total over 2 years is $9.5 million. Now, if they were ending early, if you look at the average for the first year over 12 months, it's $4 million. So I'm assuming year 2 was 6. And so they bought out of the contract early at $9.5 million instead of $10 million and saved themselves $500,000. And then Monster bought it. So my question for you is, does Monster come in after Muscle Farm goes away, and do they come in under or over $6 million for that first year? What do you think?
I would have to say over, just because of the comeback, and I would say it would be almost, I bet it was almost double, right? Because Muscle Farm's getting out of it because Tiger hasn't played a tournament in a year or 2. Yep.
And Monster steps in at the right moment. I think they probably paid a little bit more, and then when he wins, they look like they were geniuses.
And bonuses, right? Yeah, there's got to be, right? Yeah.
Yep. But figure that's a 2-year deal, no less than $6 million for the first year, because they would have probably come in and said, we'll match it at whatever your year 2 would have been, and then we'll do a 2-year deal. And then I don't know what happened after his success, but I would estimate, and again, please, if someone has internal working knowledge of this agreement and you want to correct us, go ahead. But just based on what we're able to find and using assumptions, which is the world that an analyst in the sponsorship industry lives on, I have to assume based on what's out there that our estimate would be no less than $6 million, but probably more, like you're saying, Joe. And then the value they got out of that was many multiple times above what they would have paid for that bag sponsorship. So
it's crazy.
Okay, last category. Typically what I do is a food for thought section where we wax philosophical for a minute, and we already did that sort of organically in the conversation. So as it relates to Fairways relationship management, last question, I have a question for you just about golf etiquette, and I was going to we can do these quickly, but where you stand when you're working with clients on a golf course on any one of the following 4 items. I'll start with trash talking.
Okay.
So there's a lot of lip service paid between, especially David Sims and Roy McAvoy on the course. It happens with a couple of other golfers, like when they're teeing off and warming up. What is the etiquette if you're just stepping onto the golf course for the first time, even if you're playing with like a group of people and it's just for fun? There are some limitations to what you can and can't do to sort of heckle each other. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And it goes back to just the level of relationship you have with the person. And you see it in pro golf. And so it gets tricky because the last thing you want to do is offend somebody. And so I always say the first time you're out, and this is what I work with people on, is stick to just being funny about their golf game and don't get personal with any jabs, right? It's, oh, hey, that was a great shot when they fly one 40 yards over the green or whatever it is. And little things like that usually plays pretty well. But it's when you start to get personal with it that you want to make sure you're on a really good footing with the relationship itself.
Yeah, makes sense. Second one I had for you, prop betting, which is a recurring theme in Ron Shelton films, specifically the one we mentioned earlier, White Man Can't Jump, and specifically Tin Cup as well, where there are all sorts of side wagers, starting with Kevin Costner's impressive golf ball juggling with a sand wedge while he bets that they can't solve a very simple riddle, ranging up to putting money on swings up into, I would consider, the ultimate prop bet, which is potentially against himself. And I promise we wouldn't get philosophical, where he shoots a 12 on the last hole of day 4 of the US Open because he believes that he can put one on the green from 200 yards out, however far he is. I mean, that's technically him wagering against himself that I believe I can do this and won't stop until he gets it and risks everything, including his entire prize money and his future career, to prove he can put one on the green. So point is prop betting pretty common? Like, even if you're just playing a friendly round of golf?
There's PGA Tour guys that would not play practice rounds with Phil Mickelson because they knew that he was going to start gambling to the tune of millions of dollars in practice rounds.
Oh, man.
My favorite prop bet in Tin Cup is when after he breaks all of his clubs except for 7-iron, he asks the gallery who wants to bet him if he can par in with just a 7-iron. I love that part. It's so funny. It's funny you bring it up. I'm actually working on an online course right now that's a guide to games and gambling, because there are situations where it's very useful and it's a good way to create a good memory on the golf course for people, right? I don't advise hustling people. I think that's not great. So wait a few holes until and they know your playing ability, that they'll want to actually gamble with you. And then I always advise people to stay away from big money. Play for 10, maybe $20 is all.
Yeah, especially in Vegas if you're at a golf course out here.
Yeah, there's some hustlers out there down there in Vegas, Ross.
Third thing, breaking clubs on the course. I mean, when they break every club in McAvoy's bag, how much do you think they hold up the golfers behind them? What is sort of the rule? Obviously, I mentioned I had a hard time being patient playing golf, especially when I was younger, when I was a teenager. That's improved some as I've gotten older. I've become more patient, I think, just with age, but it can be a frustrating game. And even Renee Russo starts swearing at the beginning and throwing her clubs. So what is the etiquette for if you get frustrated anywhere in your first round, even when you're starting out? Is the rule like, break your first club, or just you stay away from it completely? I say that jokingly.
I stay away from it because you're going to have to pay to get it replaced. When I started having to pay for my own golf equipment, that's when I stopped breaking clubs.
Yeah. And then I guess the last question is, I get that he's got all the media attention at the end of that round, but you and I have played around together. If you're out on the course and let's say you're trying to get over some sort of hazard, a water hazard, and you've got people behind you that are looking to play through, but you're convinced if you take 12 shots, you can eventually make one of them. What is the rule in terms of, our joke earlier about rate of play? What's the rule on taking 12 shots from the same spot on a golf course?
I advise against it if someone's behind you. Pace of play is not necessarily about how fast you play the round, but definitely about where you're positioned on the golf course.
Yeah.
And so people notice if there's empty holes in front of you, right? And so if there's empty holes in front of you and there's a group behind you waiting, you're playing too slow.
Yeah.
So I would advise against hitting extra shots if you can.
That's a great tip.
Yeah.
Anything else? We've covered a lot of ground here. I really appreciate all the history you provided. I think it's helpful. We said when we first started this podcast, we want this to be the People magazine of, sponsorship podcasts, where it can have broader appeal than just sitting down and talking about, pro sports naming rights agreements and the ins and outs. And we got into the weeds of how you do pro sports sponsorships and NIL deals to an extent. Anything else that, you think, if you were listening to this, you're new to the industry for the first time and you're just trying to get a sense of, what can I learn from this? What aren't we touching on? And what would you kind of have as be your final thought or takeaway?
I think somebody new getting into the industry, and I teach this to coaching clients as well, is you don't try it. Every time you step into the room, you don't need to close a deal, right? It's about building a relationship, building trust and mutual respect. The saying goes, the checks don't get signed until after the scorecard gets signed. So don't think you only have 18 holes, and I'm speaking in metaphor here, which is kind of annoying, but don't think you only have those 18 holes to close a deal.
It's in the theme of the podcast. Tin Cup only talks in golf metaphors. So please.
Yeah, right. In metaphor. I love the poem he talks about when he's at the very first doing the lesson.
Nod to the gods.
Unfinished symphony of Roy McAvoy's golf swing.
He's like, well, it's because I never finish anything. Yeah, it's great.
Right? Because people think my swing looks unfinished, or that I've never finished anything in my life. So,
no, I think it's
which would have been better if you think about it as a story arc. Because if you run out of golf balls in a tournament, you're disqualified. And I think he hit the last one on the green, right? And so if he had hit that in the water, it would have just completed the whole arc of never finishing anything in his life.
Which he finally does on the 12th swing from the same spot. Well, great point to end on. Joe, this has been a pleasure. Really
Yeah, a
enjoyed
lot
this
of fun.
conversation. I think it's really going to be valuable to folks that, like we've talked about, maybe new to sponsorship and maybe picked up, if you've done this before and, you're in the industry, maybe picked up something a little bit new. But either way, this has been a lot of fun talking about this particular subject in this film in particular with you, Joe. Where can they find, you had mentioned you're putting together some information about responsible gaming on a golf course as you're playing. Where can they find that information? Do you have that on the Fairways site?
Yeah, I've got everything that I offer on my website, just fairwaysrm.com. There's everything from our one-on-one coaching to in-person sessions, corporate events, things like that. We're actually just confirmed our first corporate event at Black Desert Resort coming up at the end of February of 24. So that's going to be a lot of fun. We'll probably fill up that one really quick, but I'm sure there'll be more to come in the future.
And if KT Tape wants to partner with the University of Utah, I assume you're the first point of contact, right?
I'll drive down to Orem real quick and give them a visit.
Well, thanks again, Joe. This has been False Market Value. This episode has been produced by DJ Cruiser out of KSD Studios in Fort Mill, South Carolina. My name is Ross Kennerly, founder of Quant Sponsorship Consulting. Our guest today has been Joe Canfield, founder and CEO of Fairways Relationship Management. Joe, always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for doing this, and we'll see you all next time.